Honestly, there are 7 people I have never and will never forgive. Not just for one thing, but for a long chain of betrayals. They know exactly who they are, and so do I.
There are 7 people George Harrison never forgave and never would. Not just for one mistake, but for a long chain of betrayals. They knew exactly who they were, and George knew it too. To the public, he was always remembered as the quiet one of the Beatles, calm, gentle, and romantic. But that was only part of the untold story. Behind the smile and thoughtful eyes was a list of names he deeply despised. Some were close bandmates, some were global music legends. Some he mocked for their voices, others he accused of using spirituality as a gimmick to dress up their music. And some were once friends who later ignored or ridiculed him. The last name on that list, surprisingly, was tied to the infamous white powder of Hollywood's backstage scene. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in Liverpool. Growing up in a working-class family, he inherited his love for music from his mother and soon revealed a natural talent. At 16, he left school to train as an electrician, later joining the Quarrymen on tour in 1960. No one could have imagined that this trip would set him on the path to becoming part of the Fab Four, securing his place in music history. On stage, George Harrison stood out for his serious, focused, and quiet presence, earning him the nickname the Quiet Beatle from the press. That label became even more firmly attached after an incident just days before the Beatles' appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. At the time, Harrison was struck with a severe throat infection, and doctors ordered him to remain completely silent until the performance. That night was not only a legendary debut, but also the beginning of a quiet image that would follow him throughout his entire career. Yet quiet did not mean submissive. During tours, George's reserved personality often clashed with the louder and more dominant energy of the other members. It was in these moments that simmering tensions began to surface. Even as he grew as a songwriter, Harrison was still limited to only 2 or 3 songs per album, and the media almost entirely overlooked him. Each time one of his songs was cut or pushed to the B-side, the disappointment grew deeper. The sense of being undervalued came not only from within the band, but also from the music industry itself. Over time, these wounds accumulated into lasting resentment, eventually hardening into grudges that would span decades. One of those grudges was aimed at Elvis Presley, the very idol of his youth who later became a bitter disappointment. In the early 1950s, a seemingly random moment would change George Harrison's life forever. While riding his bike past a house, he heard the sound of Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. Just a few notes were enough to strike him like lightning, igniting something powerful within the Liverpool teenager. From that moment on, rock and roll was no longer just music. It became the pulse in his veins. Harrison later recalled that the first time he heard Elvis, he knew he would never be the same again. Throughout his youth, alongside the other Beatles, he was deeply influenced by Presley. The image of the young man with a guitar, raw vocals, and a rebellious swagger became for him the very embodiment of music that could change a life. More than a decade later, in the 1970s, when George Harrison finally met his idol, the image began to collapse. What he saw was no longer the free-spirited Elvis of old, but a man in a glittering white jumpsuit, surrounded by female backup singers and blaring trumpets, all wrapped in the glitz of the Las Vegas stage. After the meeting, Harrison sighed to his friends. He said he just wanted to tell Elvis to put on a pair of jeans, a black shirt, drop the backup singers and the trumpets, and simply play like he used to. That remark, reportedly, reached Elvis. Those close to him recalled that he gave a cold smile and muttered that if anyone thought he would go back to playing in small bars just to please someone, then they knew nothing about Elvis Presley. From that moment, the distance between Harrison and Elvis grew wider. For Harrison, it was regret over a purity that had vanished. For Elvis, it was irritation at being criticized by a young English musician while still ruling the Las Vegas stage. Yet Elvis was not the only blow to Harrison's ideals. Within the Beatles, someone who had once been a kindred spirit soon became a creative rival. That person was Paul McCartney. Among the Fab Four, George Harrison and Paul McCartney were the first to find each other. At the start, they were just two boys on the same bus, bonding over a shared love of music. They would sit together, pass a guitar back and forth, work out chords, and practice until their fingers were raw. McCartney once affectionately called Harrison his kid brother. But that brotherhood was soon tested and fractured under the spotlight they had built together. By 1967, with the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, hailed as a masterpiece, McCartney's dominant creative influence became clear. From then on, he began to assert near total control, pushing Harrison's contributions to the margins. Before 1969, Harrison constantly struggled to be recognized as an equal to McCartney. His songs were often pushed aside, leaving him deeply frustrated as a songwriter who longed for creative freedom. The tension peaked during the Abbey Road sessions in 1969. Harrison fought to defend his work, rejecting McCartney's suggested changes. The situation grew so heated that McCartney later admitted he had always thought their songs were better than Harrison's, but by then, his were at least just as good. Harrison fired back bluntly, saying he would rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney. In the early 70s, George Harrison spoke candidly about his struggles within the Beatles. He respected Paul McCartney as a musician, even calling him a great bass player, but admitted Paul often overpowered him. In one interview from 1974, he even said Paul had ruined him as a guitar player. Still, despite the tension, George acknowledged there was a strange bond between them, something unspoken that tied them together like brothers. His difficulties with John Lennon were even sharper. At first, George admired John's wit and creative brilliance, but as the band grew in fame, that admiration turned into frustration. Lennon's towering presence and dismissive attitude often left George feeling sidelined. When Harrison brought in new songs, John sometimes brushed them off with little more than a shrug. By the later years, John openly mocked George's spiritual interests, cutting him down whenever he spoke about Indian music or philosophy. Their relationship grew cold and distant, and in his memoir I Me Mine, Harrison almost erased John entirely, choosing silence over direct criticism. Even after Lennon's death, George never sugarcoated the past or pretended the wounds had healed. Outside the Beatles, Harrison also showed flashes of blunt honesty. In 1992, during a session with Bob Geldof, he did not hold back when asked about Neil Young. He admitted he was not a fan and went further, saying he hated Young's voice and could not stand it. He even mocked Neil's guitar solos, laughing with Eric Clapton at what he considered clumsy playing. That same year, fate put them both on stage at Bob Dylan's 30th anniversary concert, an ironic reminder of how Harrison's sharp tongue sometimes clashed with his otherwise quiet image. Dozens of major artists gathered to honor Bob Dylan, but backstage the mood between George Harrison and Neil Young was tense. George kept his distance and rarely made eye contact. Neil was aware of the criticism Harrison had made about him, something music journalists had reported at the time. Yet Neil chose not to retaliate. In front of the cameras he smiled, praised the Beatles, and spoke with respect. They changed everything, he said, and he would always be grateful for the doors they opened. When asked about Harrison's remarks, he simply replied that everyone was entitled to an opinion. On stage that night, Neil stood close to George, smiling as they sang together, acting as if no criticism had ever been spoken. Harrison did not look friendly, but he also did not cause trouble. They played for the audience, but the distance between them was obvious. For George, these feelings were not only about a voice. With another musician, it went much deeper, because he believed that man was a false prophet. During the height of the counterculture, when peace and spirituality were celebrated everywhere, George held firmly to one principle: never compromise with falsehood. To him, music and spirituality were inseparable, both requiring absolute sincerity. Pete Townshend of The Who was one of rock's biggest icons, known for his thunderous guitar style, his stage presence, and his spiritual themes in the rock opera Tommy. Townshend openly promoted the teachings of Meher Baba, speaking of peace and enlightenment. But Harrison did not believe him. In a 1966 interview with India Today, George criticized Townshend directly, saying that every time he met him, he was stoned and talking nonsense, and that his religious talk was not serious. To Harrison, Townshend's spirituality was nothing more than a performance, a show without true depth. He saw it as a betrayal of art and a stain on the culture he wanted to protect. The tension was worsened by a personal detail. Pete Townshend had quietly supported Eric Clapton in his pursuit of Pattie Boyd, George's first wife, which led to Clapton's famous love song Layla. Harrison never publicly blamed Townshend, but it was hard to imagine that it left no mark. For George, this conflict was not about guitar skills or influence, but about the sacred versus the superficial, truth against pretense. He wanted purity in music and was not afraid to challenge even the biggest names. When Britpop ruled the charts, Harrison was introduced to a new phenomenon. Oasis was hailed as the heirs to the Beatles, but George was unimpressed. In 1996, speaking to Independent Radio News, he dismissed Liam Gallagher, the band's frontman, as outdated and rather silly. He went further, saying that when you see Oasis without Liam holding the microphone, it proves he is just excess baggage. This was more than a personal insult. It was a rejection of the entire Britpop hype. A year later, in a French interview, Harrison summed up his opinion of Liam Gallagher in a single cutting line, leaving no doubt about where he stood. Liam Gallagher did not take George Harrison's words lightly. For someone like him, it was almost a public challenge. He fired back on MTV News, turning the clash into headlines across the music press. Liam admitted he still loved the Beatles, but called George a clown and said he would have no problem telling him that to his face. He went further, accusing Harrison of being out of touch and relying only on newspapers for his opinions. From that point on, the gap between the Beatles generation and the Britpop generation became sharper, and instead of a symbolic handshake between two British icons, the world witnessed a very public war of words. Not all of Harrison's conflicts, however, were fueled by ego or pride. One case was far more complex, involving both disappointment in music and the shadow of drugs. To the public, George Harrison and Elton John seemed like friends. They played together, appeared at parties, and smiled for the cameras. But beneath the surface, their relationship was not so warm. In 1976, Harrison gave a blunt opinion, saying that Elton's music never impressed him. He claimed every song sounded the same, that Elton had written one good tune many years earlier, and that the rest followed a formula of 4 chords, some lyrics, and instant success. For Elton, who was at the height of his career, this was a sharp cut. Yet Elton John never attacked back. Instead, years later he spoke of Harrison with respect, calling him the wise man of the Beatles who had found something greater than fame. In his memoir, he even recalled a private moment at a party when Harrison looked at him seriously and told him to cut down on the drugs. It was said not with malice but with genuine concern, making George one of the few who dared to speak so honestly. Their bond was complicated, filled with contradictions. Harrison might have dismissed Elton's music, but he still cared for the man. Elton, despite the criticism, remembered George as someone real in a world full of empty flattery. Their story was a reminder that even in the polished world of fame, true sincerity sometimes appeared like a scratch on the surface, raw but honest. If this glimpse into their lives has made you see things differently, give this story a like so we can bring more heartfelt moments to you. Share it with those you care about as a reminder that honesty and love are always worth preserving. And do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next moving story. Tell us in the comments what you feel, because sometimes your own story can inspire someone else.